Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. I write fiction for fun and profit. Before we get to today's show, we have to do one thing real quick, and that's a little spot from our sponsor. Fortunately enough, our sponsor is me. In a world of valor and magic, two soldiers flee from their past. An isolated mountain town suffers under the heel of a vicious band of brigands. An offer of redemption for the one, salvation for the other, but not without great risk to both. Action and adventure await in Glimmer Vale, the first book of the Glimmer Vale Chronicles. Get your copy today, wherever great books are sold. Hello friends, it is Story Saturday, and we are continuing on with stories from last year's project that I crushed, the third volume that I did last year of short fiction. And we are back into my Acheron Confederation Navy military sci-fi setting, since I can talk, because I'm a writer and I talk good. The story's called Lights Out, Shipmate, and it's kind of fun. I wrote it, I'm reading it, it's awesome, you will like it. So let's get to it. Talk to you on the other side. When the lights flickered and went out, and the background noise of ventilation coursing throughout the ship faded from a dull rumble into an unnatural-seeming silence, Carl's day went from already cruddy to the worst time ever. It wasn't just that he was elbow-deep into an electrical panel when the lights went out. It wasn't just that it was the sixth panel he'd been in all morning, trying in vain to run down the fault that had the ship's CO2 scrubbers malfunctioning. It wasn't just that he'd been up for almost 40 hours straight and he saw no hope of getting downtime in the near future. Hell, that fact made him welcome the loss of lighting, gave him an excuse for a nap. Or it would if the chief hadn't been coming around to check on his status every 15 minutes or so. No, the worst part was he wasn't even supposed to be here today. It was a pathetic complaint, like something a whiny jackass would say, but it was true. Carl had leave planned and approved. He was supposed to have disembarked the ship yesterday when they made a brief stop for personnel at the Copernicus station. He was going to join a couple buddies who were on shore duty in the Frigron, go down to the surface of New California, hop on a chartered boat from Ventura, and sail over to Temecula for a week of wine tasting, hiking, and no Navy fun to celebrate his 30th birthday. And then Buckley had to go and screw it all up. Not that Carl could really hold it against him. Buckley couldn't control coming down with appendicitis and having to be medevaced, and it wasn't Buckley's fault. Carl was the only other guy with work center supervisor quals in their division, and regs required at least one on board at all times. No, that was Chief's fault. And the Changs. You could have pushed Stauffer and Benson to get their quals done faster, EM1, said the annoying voice in Carl's head that always seemed to point out when he was being a jackass. That made him want to grind his teeth because the little voice was right. He had focused more on the younger guys' watchstanding quals and their more advanced maintenance quals, and now it was biting him in the butt, which did nothing to help his current predicament. Even before the lights turned off, he couldn't see much. The panel he was deep into was wedged between the port-side plasma medium condenser and a bulkhead in the lower level of ICS Rodney Jacobs' main machinery room. And naturally, the panel access was hinged, so it opened toward the narrow gap between the edge of the condenser and the rest of the space. So the only way to get in was for Carl to squeeze himself past the panel, scrunch down, and then open the access. But that essentially blocked him off from the rest of MMR lower level, like he was in his own little cave or something. A cave made of metal and wire cables and piping with high temperature and extremely deadly plasma medium being collected and condensed just a few centimeters away from where he was now wedged. Normally, he didn't think too much about the properties of the materials used to generate power and gravitics on the Jacobs. But then, usually, Carl stood watching maneuvering, which could be quickly sealed off in the event of a plasma line rupture. And normally he didn't really worry about a rupture because one of those hadn't happened for real in at least a decade, maybe more, in a fleet of hundreds of ships. So really the risk was lower than driving a car, much lower. But for whatever reason, when he was right up against the condenser, like right now, he couldn't help but ponder how much it would suck if that happened, and sometimes he'd get the idea that it was going to happen any second now. So when the lights went out, Carl's first thought was that this was it. He was about to be melted alive. At least it'll be quick, he hoped. But then after a few seconds of not being melted, and without the lights coming back on, he let out a groan. Somebody better be pulling a prank, he said, loudly enough that it should travel easily through the now much quieter space. Except the lack of ventilation noise put the lie to his statement even before he finished making it. Not that the MMR was actually quiet. The condenser hummed from the activity within its innards. Elsewhere, pumps turned to bring the condensed plasma medium forward into the reactor compartment in the fusion chamber, there to be ionized and sent back down the plasma conduits to the main engines and the ship's service electrical generators in MMR upper level, and then back to the condenser next to him. That all made noise of various frequencies, high-pitched and low, but for whatever reason the ventilation noise always stood out. Maybe because it was the proverbial canary in the coal mine. Sometimes the first sign that there was a problem somewhere on the ship wasn't an alarm or a casualty announcement over the 2MC or the 1MC, but an audible change in the ventilation flow. The vent fans were on the non-vital electrical buses, the ones least protected from power loss in the event of a fault somewhere, so they tended to trip offline sooner in a casualty than later. But lighting was from the vital bus, the same buses as powered the reactor protection systems and the tactical and navigation systems up forward. The plasma medium condensate pumps shouldn't still be running and the lighting fail, but they were. Carl could hear and feel their vibration plainly from where he was sitting. So what was going on? And where the hell are the emergency lights, he muttered, as he wriggled around and pulled out the little pen light he always carried in a cargo pocket of his navy blue underway uniform. Emergency lighting came directly from the battery bus. There was no way those shouldn't have activated. He blinked when the pen light came on, his eyes having adjusted quickly to the near-complete darkness. Not absolute darkness. There were glow-in-the-dark labels on most of the equipment in the MMR, and brighter, self-illuminated strips attached to the emergency atmosphere system manifolds located in the overheads throughout the ship. That made for a pervasive and faint but very detectable, greenish glow in the few seconds it took to get the penlight on. Not nearly bright enough to actually do anything useful with it, but it was better than complete, absolute blackness. The penlight was still a godsend, though. Its little beam seemed like a sword slicing the darkness away, so well did even the small bit of visibility compare with what had been there just a moment ago. Carl flashed the light around for a moment to make sure nothing had shifted unexpectedly during the moments of darkness, but of course nothing had. There wasn't anything to shift, just his tool bag that he had dropped beside the open door of the panel, door's panel blocking his way out into the rest of the space, the condenser behind him and to his left, more ducting and piping to the right, and the gray-white tile of the deck beneath his feet, just as it had been before the lights went out. He considered the panel and immediately decided the ship had bigger fish to fry. Figuring out what had caused the loss of all lighting and how it had happened was much more important than a glitch in one of the scrubbers. As he closed up the panel, he ran through a half a dozen interlocks and automatic bus transfer devices that should have made a loss of lighting, including the emergency lights, all but impossible. There must have been a couple of very serious failures. Was there a flaw in the ship's electrical system design? But the Potter-class frigates had been operating for almost 40 years. Jacobs herself was 20 years old. If there had been a major design flaw, it surely must have reared its head before now. Carl got the panel closed and wriggled his way through the gap between it and the bulkhead, then straightened to his full height, stretching out the kinks that had accumulated while being scrunched over back there for the last hour or so. Then he turned to the right, sweeping the beam of his penlight around and listening to the hum of operating equipment. The normal hum that he would have expected in MMR lower level, except for the lack of ventilation noise. But where was the lower level watch? MM2 Bremer should be here somewhere, making his rounds and taking his logs. Surely he'd have his flashlight on and be keeping up with his duties. But Carl's light was the only weapon fighting against the darkness. What the hell? He said to himself. Again. Then he raised his voice. Bremer? No response, just the hum of equipment and the pounding of Carl's heart in his ears, because this had gone from annoying to puzzling to alarming now. There was an internal communication station around the corner by the number 2 plasma medium condensate pump. Carl hurried over, ducking beneath a low-hanging pipe to reach the IC handset. Raising it to his ear, Carl flipped the call station switch to maneuvering and hit the buzzer. The IC buses were intentionally low-tech for reliability. They had an amplified setting, but they also had a backup sound-powered capability so they could still function even though the loss of all shipboard power. So the watchstanders in maneuvering certainly should have heard his buzz and pick up. But after 10 seconds, the line remained silent. Carl buzzed again. Still nothing. Alarm was becoming actual fear now. Where was everybody? There was a ladder up to MMR upper level, 10 meters forward from the IC box. When Carl reached the ladder and went to climb up, he found the hatch at its top closed. He pursed his lips. This was another oddity in a day that had become nothing but. Normally the hatches were kept open for ease of access, with chain gates at the top to protect against someone falling down the ladder. They were only shut at battle stations when the crew set condition zebra throughout the ship. But they hadn't gone to zebra. It had been a normal steaming day. Grunting, Carl stuck his penlight between his teeth and turned the dogging hand mechanism wheel for the hatch. 6 turns counterclockwise and the hatch was free, and he pushed it up. It rose and struck the stanchion above and behind the hatch, and Carl heard the click of the latching mechanism that was in place to hold the hatch open. Safe to pass through, Carl hoisted himself up and out of the ladder well into a space that was just as dark as the level below. It was differently arranged, of course. Lower level was all pipes and pumps and condenser equipment and wire runs and panels. Upper level housed the main electrical distribution switchboards in its forward section, where Carl had emerged from below. All around him were looming gray cabinets holding circuit breakers and bus transfer switches with great sheaves of wire bundles plugged into the tops of the cabinets by quick-release connections. The breaker panels had small LED lights showing status of their various power supplies, all green. All green. Carl moved down the path between the rows of cabinets, scanning them up and down. Not a single breaker was tripped. Not a single indication light showed anything out of the ordinary, except for the lack of lights and ventilation. Carl's puzzlement shifted, his fear turning with it towards suspicion. This wasn't some kind of casualty that had taken the ship down, or something somewhere would have had an indication of trouble. Someone must be pulling a... He stepped out from the row of cabinets in the area forward of maneuvering. Maneuvering itself was an enclosed box straight ahead of him. To port and starboard were the housings for the ship service electrical generators, mounted just above the port and starboard plasma medium condensers. He knew this area well. He'd held countless pre-evolution briefings with his division or with the watch team here before going on about their work. It was a good place for it since it was one of the few mostly open spaces in the engineering plant, and maneuvering was right close by so the engineering officer of the watch could be kept in the loop without having to repeat too much of the briefing. Now as he stepped into this area, he found himself taking a half-step backwards as sudden brilliance flared across his vision. He blinked and raised his right hand before his face and answered the question that had sprang into his mind for the 6th time in what felt as many minutes. What in the hell is going on? As soon as it came. The space was filled by people in the Icaran Confederation Navy's navy blue underway uniform, all looking at him and grinning broad, shit-eating grins that said they got him good and they knew it, and knew that he knew it. The whole of the electrical division was there except for Stauffer, who was on watch and maneuvering right now. The chief and Ensign Collins, the electrical officer, were on the left side of the crowd. The Chang, Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, was on the right and was at the XO over by the starboard side door to maneuvering. Chief and the Divo had a clearly handmade but still not too terrible-looking banner that said, "Happy Birthday, EM1" on it. And no sooner had Carl come to register the scene than all present shouted the same at him. Carl blinked again. Then he shook his head. "You bastards," he said, and realized he was laughing as he said it. "Had you going, didn't we, EM1?" said the youngest member of the division, a doughy-faced guy from Trinity who looked 13 despite being almost 20, and who did need to shave but once a week to stay in regs. Kaplan had been on board for all of a month and a half, and Carl hadn't figured out what to make of him yet. He was smart, sure, and he knew one end of an O-meter from the other, but he always seemed to be there wherever Carl went. He wasn't sure if Kaplan was just brown-nosing or honestly saw him as a mentor or father figure or something, but it was annoying sometimes. Right then, though, Carl could only shrug and spread his hands in surrender. "We felt that you lost out on your birthday plans," Chang said, "so I figured we'd make it up to you a bit. Chief?" The chief nodded and set out of sight around the number 1 ship service electrical generator enclosure. He emerged back a second later holding a tray. The tray had a cake on it. And the cake had lit candles? Open flame on a starship? 1, where had they gotten the candles? And 2, who had given permission to light them? And what the hell was food doing in the engineering spaces? That was verboten. In his mind, Carl started computing how many regulations the guys had broken on his behalf. He stopped when he got to 7 and realized that he could continue on for quite a while before the counting even became difficult. How in the... Carl looked back over at the XO, who was watching the whole thing in silence from beside maneuvering. He knew the XO was getting out soon. In fact, he had booked his charter boat with the XO's friend, the guy he was going into business with as soon as his resignation paperwork went through. XO hadn't been the one to bend the rules much in the past. He couldn't. That was really the opposite of the XO's job. CEO could be the good guy and bend the rules, since they were his rules. XO couldn't. He made sure the CO's rules were followed. So the CO must have authorized all those myriad violations, but he wouldn't show up to give explicit approval, for reasons. Carl wasn't sure whether to feel good and appreciative for the obvious consideration, or horrified over the potential shit show they had stirred up on his behalf. Carl looked from the XO back to the chief and the cake. Thanks. He stopped, nodded, then nodded again. Really, thanks, I appreciate it, but... He looked back at the Chang, pausing briefly on the XO. How about we take that to the department office, or cruise mess? Chang nodded. Good idea. Gentlemen? Snickering and chuckles followed Carl's division mates as they led the way to the starboard side of MMR upper level, and then forward toward the airtight hatch that separated the engineering plant from the rest of the ship. Chang followed behind, and Carl went to follow him, but the XO stepped up next to him. At his questioning look, XO said, Wanted you to know I talked with Sammy. Sammy was the owner of the charter company. He said when we were able to let you go, he'll give you first priority for rescheduling your trip, and a discount for your trouble. Carl blinked. Thanks, sir, but aren't you shooting yourself in the foot a bit with that? XO made a half laugh, half snort. Good customer service is good business. Besides, the light-hearted tone left and became serious, very nearly somber. We sometimes have to give up too much for this line of work. His eyes flicked away from Carl, sweeping across the room. But Carl had the idea he was more looking over the entire ship in his mind. When we get to take back a little, we should. Then he grinned again and clapped Carl on the shoulder. Come on, EM1. I don't know about you, but that cake looks good. He moved to follow the division forward. Carl paused, considering the XO's final words for a moment, and he decided the XO was right. That was one damn good-looking cake. He hurried forward to his birthday party. Not quite the party he had planned on, but in some ways, maybe better. Alright, so fun and games on the ICS Jacobs. Should come as no surprise that people on a naval vessel occasionally play pranks on each other. I know that's a shock. Never would have entered your mind, but it does indeed happen. The pranks tend to run from just fun to cruelly fun. But, they're pranks nonetheless. Lighthearted fun. It works out well. And, of course, so wanted to show some of that in this story. And, of course, surprise birthday parties are always fun, too. So hope you liked that one. That was enjoyable. I don't remember specifically what prompted me to write that. I was just doing my weekly thing. But it turned out well. I liked it, and it's definitely helping because that's one of the stories that's going into the stretch goals for the Warfare Qualified Kickstarter campaign that I did a month and a half or so back, and that I need to deliver on here by the end of the year. So you get a preview of that if you back the campaign. Yay! Anyway, we are having fun with that, and next week we're going to have more fun because we're going to continue on in this volume 3 of what I did last year. Next week is a crime story called Easy Money. I'm very sure it is a crime story. Oh yeah, this is about a guy who, well, it's a crime story. Guy gets in over his head and thinks he's getting out of it. Has a plan to get out of it over his head or something. We'll find out next week on Story Saturday. Hey, dog, stop scratching. I'm recording here. She always has to interrupt. Silly girl. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so come back next week. We're going to do that story and continue on. We are also, of course, going to continue with our usual Music Monday thing on Mondays. If you haven't been paying attention to that, you should do that. And we are continuing periodically gaming. I have gotten away from doing much in the way of the gaming stuff the last couple weeks just because I have been bloody busy and my schedule got a little screwed up by for one thing, I had took a job as a poll worker for the election here in San Diego, and so last week I had to do some training for that, and that took up my days, and so I had to do money making stuff at night, and that messed up some of my time that I would do, gaming or other things. And then this week I've been just head down doing just money and writing stuff. But this coming up week, we should be able to get back into that as well. We'll see how that works out. So good fun times here this morning. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you do, of course, like what we're doing here, make sure you have liked, make sure you've subscribed to what we're doing, and go over to michaelkingswood.com/store where you can find all the books I've got for sale. And you can pick up some books, show some support, help keep the lights on around here. Alternately, of course, you can go over to the Substack, michaelkingswood.substack.com, where you can read stories of mine, and you can do a little subscribe to the stack, and or there's a paid feature there if you want to throw some bucks my way, help things out. Otherwise, just come back next week, tell all your friends, and we'll go to the next story that we talked about. I think that's it. I've been talking around myself for too long. I'm going to sign off and get to other business. Hope you enjoyed this, and come back next time. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.